Hello and welcome to the latest edition of Rugby League Back Chat. We've had yet another busy week in the world of Rugby League, and to talk us through it we have three very, very special guests, starting with Jodie Cunningham, St Helens player for the Women's Super League side, Gary Hetherington, the Chief Executive of Leeds Rhinos, and Martin Sadler, the editor of League Express. Well, Gary, given that we've got you here, I think it would be amiss if we didn't start on Thursday night. Quite the epic game, I think it has to be said. Golden Point, a victory in the end. You made hard work of it. I guess you were just very relieved at the end that you didn't throw that victory away.
Yeah, absolutely. We were desperate for a win before the game, and know that playing against Castleford is always a special game. And I think last year's game between the two teams went to 25-24, and just as close again.
Martin, Golden Point, it's the second time we've seen it. I think we haven't had it go past one set yet, but nevertheless, that was an unforgettable moment, wasn't it?
Well, I'm not really a great fan of the Golden Point, or I haven't been, but you'd be an absolute fool not to say that was tremendous. You know, it was a magnificent end to the game. And, of course, David Ferner made it, really, didn't he? Let's face it. I think everybody in the country probably knows now who David Ferner is. You know, he'll be coming in asking for a pay rise, Gary, before too long, I would have thought.
No harm in asking.
Yeah. But the only thing I regret about it was that the cameras didn't show Gary as well, because I think we might have seen exactly the same thing if you'd been on there, Gary.
Well, Gary, what exactly was your reaction when Brad Dwyer decided to go for a drop goal?
I did make a comment at the time as the ball were going to him, which was to the effect of, why on earth is the ball going to Brad? It's probably
expressed a bit more strongly,
probably. The
probably.
last bloke you'd want it to go to. Never dropped a goal in his life. But he does tell me now, in hindsight, that he has been a religious practicer of goals. He was waiting for the moment. And, of course, every dog has his day, and his opportunity came. And, of course, he took it extraordinarily well.
So has he knocked on your door, Gary, for more money as well?
Well, no, but once again.
Jodie, on a serious note, look, Golden Point, it was a big discussion whether we should bring it in or not. There are the purists who like the draw in this, very understandable why, but it was brought in to manufacture moments, and it did that. So what's your take on having the Golden Point?
Yeah, and I think Rugby League's great because it will try new things. I think that's one of the benefits of our sport, is that we do try new things to try and make it as appealing as possible to spectators and the fans that watch at home. And we spoke about earlier, I think I like the Golden Point. I think it's exciting, and anyone who watched that game, you can't deny that was great television. And I think these may be adaptations that can be made. So we spoke about there should be some sort of point that you can get for having the draw, so each team gets a point for getting to draw at 80 minutes.
I think the question is it fair for Castleford to end up with nothing?
Yeah, exactly.
When they got a draw?
For 80 minutes, they were as good as Leeds, so they should get a point out of that game. But then an additional
Actually, it was an
point
interesting game, because I think the Rhinos were the best team, certainly in the first half, and then we had a period in the second half where Castleford was certainly superior. It ebbed and flowed in that regard. Yeah. But yeah, I agree. I think there is, a draw is a fair result. But I think what could be considered is, after 80 minutes, both teams get 1 point, and then they're both playing for the extra point.
I like that.
Which one team may or may not get, and I think that retains the same level of excitement. Yeah. But actually does provide some recognition for the 80-minute result.
But I said in League Express that maybe we should move to a situation where we award 3 points to the winner of a Super League game, but then 2 points for the team that wins by Golden Point, and 1 point to the team that loses by Golden Point. Obviously 0 to a team that loses.
So what if it's a drawing Golden Point? Then what
I think you could potentially devise a way for making sure, a bit like a penalty shootout, maybe a drop goal shootout or something that would ultimately lead to a result.
Always a bit more complex when that.
Maybe.
You've got to think about, like last year, if you went off that system, can you imagine how many points ahead Saints would have been? The league would have been done quite early on, because of the 3 points. How often our Golden Point, realistically, we've had 2 so far, is it?
Yeah.
So realistically, in a season, the effect that would have, you'd maybe have the season done and dusted quite early on.
It's an interesting point, is that, Jodie?
If you did 3 points, that's just something I think would maybe contrast that. But I like the idea of a division of points.
Gary, on Leeds, it's been a tough start to the season. I think everyone has used the word or the phrase transitional period. How have you assessed what's gone down for the Rhinos so far in 2019?
Yeah, really disappointing start, obviously, for us. We were full of optimism and confidence about the new season. The team and the squad is going through a transitional period. We know that's not an excuse, and we've got to be careful that we don't continue how long does the transition last. But having had a new coach in David Ferner, the new coach always inherits the previous coach's squad. So inevitably there will be some change, and that change does take some time. And that's the transitional part that we're going through now, and will continue to go through as well. But nevertheless, to find ourselves with just one win after 8 games was particularly disappointing. And that's really, in many ways, the nature of this year's competition. Such a tough competition, and every team can beat everybody else. Warrington and St Helens have started the strongest, and may well finish the strongest as well. They're both in pretty good shape. But I think it's going to be ebb and flow throughout the course of the season, and everybody's got a chance of beating somebody else, and there's no surprises anymore.
I think the thing is, Gary, that you've played 9 games now and got 2 wins. But you've only had 3 home games and you've had 6 away games. And actually, if you looked at the start of the season, at your early season games, you were visiting teams like Warrington, St Helens, Wigan.
Yeah.
Most people would have probably predicted that you wouldn't have won those games anyway. I mean, it's been a distorted season for you because you've had so many away games. And the fact is, I mean, crazy as it may look, you're only 4 points outside the playoff places now. Yeah. So it's not, people... There tends to be an overreaction these days, I think, to defeats. It's always an absolute... The same with you and Wigan. You lose a couple of games and it's an absolute crisis, isn't it?
It's the same every season.
You've just lost a couple of games.
Warrington had a terrible start last season and went on and they didn't win anything in the end, but they got to 2 finals, so nothing's won at this point.
It's how we finish that counts in many respects. And, the last 9 games, the team might win all the games.
Well, Huddersfield had a similar start last year, didn't they?
And I think the league, the history is littered with teams that have good spells. Everybody will have a good spell, and everybody will have a bad spell, and some teams have more than one. But I do remember, quite a number of years ago now, but Hull, they had the same record. I remember them having 2 wins out of their first 9 games, and they ended up coming second in the league. Quite remarkable. Obviously, they had a pretty good run throughout the course of the year.
I don't think they'll come second this year, I think.
Gary, you mentioned that Dave Ferd has obviously inherited a squad. How much influence did he have in the arrivals of the 3 overseas players? Was he part of that? Obviously, Trent Merritt, Conrad Hurrell and Tui Lolohea coming in.
Yeah, very much so. David had coached Tui Lolohea with the Tongan side, but that recruitment was made early on in the piece, and so was Conrad Hurrell. Once again, David was delighted with the signing of Conrad because he coached him for Tonga, and then the latter signing was Trent Merritt, and that had been on and off, but came together, and Dave played quite a key role in Trent joining us.
And Martin, naturally, it does take a while for some overseas players to get to grips with things. I think Blake Austin put in a mesmeric performances, but that was the first time we've really seen what...
Sure.
And when you've got 3 big-name players coming in, I guess there is that bit of bedding.
I think you've got to be patient, haven't you? You can't expect, for the most part, new players to come in and immediately, break all right. It's nice if they do, of course, and sometimes they do. But, I think Trent Merrin, there's been rumours about him not being particularly happy in England, but, most players, if you ask them, are not particularly happy when they're losing matches. So it would be surprising if they were, really ecstatic. But now that I think things are looking better, I mean, Trent Merrin, if you look at his stats for games so far, I think he's been a very good performer, as has Conrad Hurrell. Conrad Hurrell reminds me of Ben Murdoch-Masila, a very similar sort of player at Warrington. And, I think he's going to be a Leeds favourite. I mean, you've watched Murdoch-Masila a lot, presumably, Jodie. There's a lot of the Tongan guys are really strong guys, aren't they?
Yeah, they are, and I think he's been Leeds' go-to this season, and he has created tries out of nothing. I think the start of the season would have been a bit worse without him, to be honest, because he really can create something out of nothing, and he's that go-to player for Leeds.
He's a terrific personality as well, both on and off the field, and he's already, both him and Trent have actually become a big part of the team. But I think the other thing that often gets overlooked is the young players that's coming into the team as well. We've had 3 of our senior players in Carl Ablett, Dom Crosby and Stevie Ward, who really have not made any contribution at all so far. Stevie Ward's played a couple of games, but not many. And the others have not played at all. And Jamie Jones just come back into the side. But on the positive side, we've had 3 young players in Cam Smith, Mikhailov Adletsky and Tom Holroyd, who all played last week and playing, as very young players, academy age players, are just recently out of the academy, and that's pretty encouraging, really.
I think you had 6 players that were 24 and under in the 17-man squad on Thursday. And naturally, look, we talk about transitional periods. You are trying to bring through the next generation of youngsters.
Absolutely.
But I guess that you do have to sacrifice some short-term results as a result of that.
Well, they've got to gain experience. Only gain experience by playing.
And it's quite interesting, Gary, that Ash Handley is very near to the top of the try-scoring list at the moment. And, whenever you've got a winger scoring lots of tries, it's a very good thing to have a look who's playing inside him. And, that's, that Greg Eden at Castleford, you had you've got Michael Shenton, and Harrell feeding Handley, drawing defenders in, and, it must be wonderful playing outside.
Absolutely, it's a real threat to the opposition, and that's what you've got to create.
Yeah.
So Gary, what would constitute a satisfactory season in your eyes for Leeds Rhinos from this point onwards?
Well, we're a team that want to be challenging for honours in the league, in the cup, in every competition that we play. So there isn't our satisfaction levels are pretty high.
It's not coming 11th, is it, Gary?
It's certainly not battling down near the bottom. But once again, I think we don't pay enough respect to the other teams in the competition. It's no disgrace to get beat by anybody. And that's the nature of the competition. It's now, I think it's the most even Super League that we've ever had. And whether that continues throughout the course of the season, that remains to be seen. On the face of it, it looks as though it will. And that's a good thing for the game.
Jodie, is what we're seeing now, everyone is beating everyone. Are we seeing the salary cap working as it should do now, where everyone can go to wherever and win?
Potentially, yeah. But again, that's a debate that's been ongoing for years, isn't it? And I think it's tough because there's the big clubs like Leeds, Warrington, who've got the money to spend, who can bring in these big signings, who'll make big differences. Like Blake Austin has shown instant impact to Warrington. But there's some clubs that can't meet that salary cap. So it is a tough one. I think this year it's great rugby. I'm not too sure whether it's the salary cap that's necessarily making that. But we're just seeing anyone beating everyone.
It's been an exciting season, hasn't it?
Yeah, really exciting.
For most of us. But when we say every team's beating every other team, that's not quite true, is it? Because Saints of course, have not lost yet, and Warrington did lose at Catalans, but that was the only. And against Hull, they were absolutely ruthless and outstanding, weren't they?
Yeah, amazing.
And I think, on the face of it, at this moment in time, Saints and Warrington look to me to be the two favourites for both major trophies.
Yeah, Jodie, on St Helens, obviously, I'm sure you've watched a fair bit of them. They have been fantastic so far, haven't they?
Yeah, and they've looked more consistent than Warrington. Warrington look amazing in spells, and against Hull, they were amazing for 80 minutes. But I think that's the first full 80 that you've really seen from Warrington. Saints seem to be consistent throughout the 80 in every game, and you can still see they've got another gear to go up. And I think it'll be a tough one. I think Warrington, I grew up watching Warrington as a kid. It's always Warrington's year. It does seem like it could be Warrington's year, but who knows? And, you see ebbs and flows in the season, and it could all change. And I think that's what's great about Rugby League as well. When we're talking about the points before, it's not done early on. And these teams like Leeds have come back and won grand final from 5th a couple of times. So, playing well now is great, and them two, you have to admit, look head and shoulders above the rest at the minute. But I think it's still open, and I won't be counting any chickens for either.
But Blake Austin just looked fantastic, didn't she, on Friday? I compared him in League Express to Brett Kenny, and in his days with Wigan, obviously the great Parramatta player. And I think the way he played on Friday, I think that's a reasonably fair comparison. Particularly one of the tries where he seemed to score from about halfway and just sort of glided through the whole defence and sidestep them. He's got this ability to change direction, while running at full speed, and I think that's a massive quality.
I think it's his support play as well as the forwards. We see it's not your typical. He's getting it at first receiver and he's taking on the line. The forwards are playing, and he's just on that. He's that edge play, he's that tip play. He's always supporting around the ruck. So he's doing everything at the minute. He's busy and he's got his hands and he's involved in all the organising, but also that support play, which I think he looks really strong.
I think the biggest. So I was just going to say, I think maybe the biggest result of the weekend, Gary, was Huddersfield going to London and winning for their season, and them trying to avoid the drop, and London trying to avoid the drop. That was a really important result, wasn't it?
It was, yeah, a really nervous trip for Huddersfield with that, because London have shown themselves to be really resilient and capable of winning games, and very competitive. So so a good result for Huddersfield and the second consecutive win as well. So yeah, I mean, Huddersfield are a real threat. You look through their lineup; they have some good players.
Talking about back-to-back wins, Martin, Wigan, that was a mighty result for them. They hammered Catalans.
Absolutely.
And suddenly they're putting some form together.
And suddenly you say, well, what's the problem? They beat Catalans 42-0. I thought the interesting thing was, I mean, I obviously wasn't at the game, but people said Hardaker probably was keen to show who was the best full-back in the game, because he's not been selected in the England elite performance squad. So I think he probably feels he's got quite a lot to prove. But just going back to London, I was just going to say to Gary, when London beat you at Headingley 2 or 3 weeks ago, was that the lowest point of the season so far for Leeds?
So far this season, of course,
yeah.
Because not only was it a bad result, but it was the manner of the result as well.
Late.
It was a game that, if you look at all the statistics, then Leeds should certainly have won the game.
Yeah.
Credit to London, they came back with 2
Never
tries
gave
in
up.
the last 12 minutes and stole the game. And as I say, credit to them. But that was a particularly low point.
Yeah.
Well, I've got to say that first part of this show has absolutely flown by. We're going to take a quick break, but coming up after that short break, we're going to ask Jodie about all things the Women's Super League ahead of the big season launch. Stay right here. We'll be back after a short break. Rugby League Backchat is with you throughout the season. Right here is where you need to be for the very best debate from within the sport. Rugby League Backchat on FreeSports. Welcome back to Rugby League Backchat. Before the break, we were talking all things Leeds and Super League. We're going to turn our attention to the female game now and the Women's Super League, because that is about to start. Jodie, the big kick-off is upon us. How excited are you for what is coming up and what is a very, very big season for the Women's Super League?
I literally can't wait. For me, I think even more so. I've been out for pretty much 2 seasons with injury. I got back right at the end of last season. I came back against a strong Leeds side, actually. So for me, I literally can't wait. It's felt like the longest pre-season ever. But the build-up, I think we've had much more media coverage than we ever had before. In League Express, Rugby, all of them are covering the women's game at the minute. And it's exciting, and the girls feel that and feel special. And that's driving the standards as well. They're raising the standards and the professionalism, because because we're finally getting a bit of the spotlight. We need to step up and perform now, so I think everyone's just ready to do that on Sunday.
But Martin, from a media standpoint, the exposure has grown and grown and grown, but it's becoming a really strong competition that people are taking interest in.
Oh yeah, I mean, women's sport generally is growing and growing. Women's football, rugby union, rugby league. It's great to see, and certainly we've. It's interesting actually in League Express the way our newspapers evolved. We're having to cover so much more than we ever used to do before. It's really fascinating. But I think I'm really interested to know where all the women players are coming from, because are they actually giving up other sports to play rugby league, or are they coming to rugby league not having played any other sport at all? What's the background of most?
It's a complete spread, really.
Yeah.
I think beforehand, because there was so little coverage, and most people didn't even know there was a women's game, unless you were a diehard fan from your family of rugby league, where your dad takes you down on a weekend. It was hard to find women's rugby league, whereas now, because it's out there and it's in the media, anyone who's got that slight interest might be like, oh, I'll maybe give that a go. So at Saints, just as an example, last season we had an ex-Great Britain bobsleigh athlete that came down, tried rugby league. Obviously rugby union's the obvious one. We've got some rugby union players coming down, netballers. And it's amazing because you think the polar opposites in sports, one's completely full contact and one isn't, but the hand-eye coordination involved, you know, some of the balls that they might not necessarily have the rugby knowledge in terms of where they should be and what lines they should be running, but some of the balls they catch that are above their head or down by their ankles are better than some of the really experienced rugby league players, so it's exciting to get these athletes into the sport.
And do they, when they come from other sports, do they generally want to stick with rugby league?
Yeah, we're finding that. They come in and they really enjoy it. One of the main things I think they found is it's a really welcoming environment and that team sport. I think stereotypically some female sports are not quite so welcoming and rugby league is completely different, and maybe that is because it's always been such a minority sport that you've had to be. You can't discourage anybody from coming down. You've got to be as well, you know, everybody's welcome. It's always had that atmosphere, so you know, it's a really nice place to be.
Gary, you've obviously got the women's team at Leeds. How big an asset have they been to the Leeds Rhinos?
Oh, terrific. You know, we're really keen to promote the women's Super League team and indeed all women's rugby league in our city, and there's a big development programme in place. The Leeds Rhinos Foundation are responsible for a lot of the development, and we've got full-time development officers now focused very much on the women's game. So the pathways now and the number of participants is growing all the time. The aspirant is Leeds Rhinos Super League team. They've been very successful, and you know, they are effectively owned and managed by the club, and we see them just as another professional arm of our team. We've got the Leeds Rhinos first team, we've got the Leeds Rhinos academy team, we've now got the Leeds Rhinos women's team, and we want that to be as professional as possible. The players don't get paid. Maybe that's one thing for the next phase, really. Absolutely. But in terms of professionalism, you know, we want them to be on a par with our first team and academy team.
Gary, in 10 years' time, do you think you'll be running the women's team and you'll have 3 import players from Australia who are the female equivalent of her own?
Well, we're looking at bringing in one from Australia this year, in actual fact.
Right.
I think that's once again providing opportunities for players from this country to be able to go to Australia and vice versa. It's great sort of experience, and once again, it's part and parcel of the benefits of playing rugby league as opposed to
Would you
other
like
sports.
to play in Australia, Jodie?
I think as any rugby league player, I think the idea of playing in Australia is definitely exciting, and that is definitely something that I would maybe look into. But for me, I think it's tough because we spoke about the men's team and about how, you know, you've had some quality signings at Leeds, but it's not quite clicking despite the talent. That's something I think over here we need to focus on, making the England women talent pool as strong as it can be. So for me, especially being out for so long, I've got to focus on making sure I'm playing as well as I can. I'm a full-back, so playing off the half-backs and playing with my centres and outside backs, I want to really get that as strong as possible leading into the World Cup. But for some of these young players, I think the chance to go and play in Australia, I think, could be incredible.
Jodie, you mentioned the injuries you've had. I mean, you've had it very often. There are a lot of cases of that, aren't there? There's some fascinating stories of players working so hard to get back after so long out. The demands are really, really high. And the fact that you're not full-time, unlike some of the Super League, the men's equivalent, it must take a lot out of your bodies trying to play to the professional standard that we're all striving to get to.
Yeah, that's one of the toughest parts, I feel, because you're trying to get your body in as the best condition it possibly can be for what is a really, really tough sport. And before, that's what's amazing about the Women's Super League. Now we've got the physio support, the strength and conditioning support to make us as robust as we can be. But before, you know, if you haven't got the knowledge of how to make yourself the best athlete you can be for the sport, then you might not necessarily be doing the right things. And I was out for a long time and it was difficult with work, so I had a full-time job and I was trying to go to physio appointments. When I had my ACL reconstruction, I was off work for 8 weeks and didn't get paid. So, you know, that's tough and that's a barrier for women playing the sport. So the introduction of the Women's Super League, where they get that physio support so that they're getting the right things happening, and it's that support around the full-time job rather than, you know, it's 2 o'clock in the middle of the day on a Wednesday, you've got to get down. That's tough, you've got to take a day off work. So everything's going in the right direction, and you get a lot of comments. For me, rugby league isn't a hobby, and that is a lot of, you know, it's only a hobby, and to me it's not, it's my life, and my job's always been to support my playing. So when I was out injured for so long and I thought I wasn't going to make the World Cup, my world fell apart, and I'm really close to Lois Forsell at Leeds, and I know she's having it tough at the minute, and I'm constantly in contact with her because it's your life and it's what you care about. So it's a really tough part of the sport, and I think any athlete who goes through a long-term injury can understand what you go through.
You've been playing the game since you were 12, haven't you? Was it always just rugby league for you as a younger girl?
I tried the sport for the first time at 12. Before then, I wasn't interested in rugby league whatsoever. I started playing at school. But as soon as I did all different sports, gymnastics, cross-country, netball, I did everything. And as soon as I played rugby league, I was like, that's it, that's the one. I just fell in love with it.
Gary mentioned that, hopefully at some point in the future that the women will be being paid to play. For you, what's the end goal for the Women's Super League? Is it more than just it being a full-time job as such? Does it need to be more than that? Do we need to keep raising the standards of professionalism, as you said we have been doing?
Yeah, and it can't all happen at once. I think, because it's now had the profile, everyone jumps on, right, they should be full-time paid athletes. And I think you don't have to be a rugby league expert. You just have to have a little bit of business acumen to know that it's not possible. The money's not there to pay these athletes. And right now, it's not what the sport needs. If you throw a lot of money at the top athletes and pay them, it's not quite as strong as it needs to be at grassroots, and we've got to grow that talent pool.
But that's true of the men's game as well, isn't it? Let's face it.
Yeah, invest there and make the game as strong as it can be, and then you look at top down, maybe then making some stars of the game.
Well, how is the grassroots going? I mean, I went to Elland, my local club, and there was loads of girls' teams there, and that was brilliant. That really caught me out. I didn't realise it was thriving as much as that. So how is the grassroots level going at the minute?
Last year was ridiculous, the growth that we had last year, because girls knew that there was something to aim for. There's really great things to attract you to rugby league. Before, if you had, say you were playing rugby union, rugby league in school, even if you were a diehard rugby league fan, rugby union was a smart choice. There's so many more opportunities for women. Whereas now, there are big things to look for and achieve. The international game, there's so many more opportunities at that level. And the 2021 World Cup, for anyone who's sort of 15, 16-year-old, there's no reason why they couldn't participate in that. I played for England at 17. Emily Rudd, she represented England in a World Cup at 16. So that is actually a possibility. It's a high thing to strive for, but it's a possibility right now. And to play at Anfield, double header at Old Trafford. There's nothing bigger really, is there?
Gary, just to branch off slightly, we've seen rugby league become a lot more inclusive recently. We've got PDRL, the Learning Disability Super League, the Women's Super League. How important is it that the sport has taken a step forward in this regard and made it more inclusive?
Yeah, I think it's been huge strides. Wheelchair as well.
Yeah, of course.
Has been hugely successful, and now I think that's a feature of rugby league. And it's always been an inclusive sport. It's always been a welcoming sport. But now there's so many different sectors to it, and all part of the rugby league family. And I think it's I think the actual expansion over the last several years is quite remarkable.
Might be the media mogul that you are.
Right.
Sorry, obviously, as we say, we've got all these various different competitions coming together now. How can the media maybe improve to make sure that the profile of wheelchair rugby league, learning disability rugby league, I'll get it out, women's suit, how can we make sure that the profile raises more and more and more?
Well, by just doubling the number of people who are reporting on it, I suppose, which is
then
quite.
It comes down to money,
yes, it's probably not feasible to a great degree at the moment. But I was just going to come back on this thing about rugby league's inclusivity, though, because I think of all the sports that I can think of, certainly in this country. But also in Australia, I think rugby league has been by far the best record of inclusivity. You look at, for example, the way we've taken on board black players throughout our history when they couldn't play other sports. The obvious one was Billy Boston, who was told he'd never play for Wales at rugby union, and came north, and in no time at all was playing for Great Britain at rugby league. We've got an incredible, even at Headingley, Roy Francis was a black coach in the 1960s. That seems quite incredible now. Clive Sullivan was the captain of Great Britain in 1972. Before any black player ever played football for England.
And we've now got Jamaica coming into.
We've got Jamaica coming into the World Cup.
Is a huge opportunity for the game.
But it's not just in terms of black players. There's a book up there, the biography of Ian Roberts, the first man to come out as being gay, back in the 1980s in Australia, and everybody accepted it. It was just, hardly a talking point in a way. But that's still not happened in most of the sports, has it? Let's face it. So we've got a lot to be proud of. Now, I sometimes wonder whether we're really whether we're as effective as we should be in promoting, this, what Jodie was just talking about. We'll take anybody. All they've got to be able to do is play the game to a reasonable standard, and we don't really care who they are, do we?
Jodie, just bring it back onto women's. You mentioned the World Cup. There's all this talk about England, the men's team, building towards 2021. What about the women's? Your goal is obviously to win the World Cup as well.
Yeah, that's the goal, and people doubt you when you say that, because if you look on past record, it's Australia and New Zealand have dominated the women's game, but that's been the same for the men for years as well, and it's in recent years England men have been really strong and really dominant, and we'll all remember that 2017 World Cup final, and it was an ankle tap away, and that's where the women's game is going. We're getting there, and right now, just last year we had, I think it was 11 debutants tour when we went to France for England. And I think that was the most convincing win I've ever participated in. And I've played for England since 2009. So, yeah, France probably weren't at the standard they were, but it was so convincing. And that was with a lot of young players and a lot of debutants. So that is really promising in itself. And that's 1 year of the Women's Super League. All the backing and the profile that it's getting now is only pushing the sport, and therefore the athletes at the top level higher and higher. And I think it was 38-0 or 36-0 against Australia in the World Cup, which everybody, a million miles away you are. But then you see, some of the games that we've seen in the Super League, and Catalan are getting beat 40-0, but then beat Warrington, who we've all just spoke about and said are amazing. Yes. So, it wasn't great, and trust me, coming off that field felt awful. But at the same time, we really aren't that far away, and the strides we've made in the last 12 months have got us really, really close, and I'm confident that even now we would definitely compete and potentially beat Australia. So in 2 years' time, we've got every chance, and on home soil with that home crowd, I think that's enough to take you there.
So who should we be keeping an eye on in women? You can't say yourself.
I'm not going to say myself, trust me. I'll be holding on, trying to reach I'm in that squad.
who should we be keeping an eye on individually? Obviously, Georgia Roach won the Women's Day last year. Is she going to be up there again, or are there other players emerging? Yeah, Georgia
Roach will be up there. She was she's only young. I think she was 18, playing in the Super League last year. Fantastic young talent. One of the key players has always been Lois. Lois is absolutely incredible, and hopefully she gets back from injury as soon as she can. She'll be a really, really strong player for England in the World Cup. Tara Stanley for Castleford, she's their full-back, which is not great for me because we play the same position, but she's incredible and has got such a good kicking game on her as well. So, I know she'll kick on again. She was one of the Women of Steel top 3 last year. So there's so many to look out for. It is tough to call, and I'm sure there'll be names in 2021 that right now I don't even know who they are, because there's so many young girls coming up, and with the development and it's the high level of coaching. It pains me to say it as a Saints player, but Leeds are really up there and they're setting the standards for across them all. Wheelchair rugby league, I know they're right up there with standards, winning the grand final and everything. So they're setting the standards with the facilities and the coaching, strength and conditioning. So that's raising the game for everybody, and by 2021, I think the current athletes and also a lot of new young athletes will be up there and competing.
All fascinating stuff. Well, after a quick break, we'll get back to talking about all the big topics in rugby league. Stay right here for the last part of Rugby League Back Chat. Welcome back to the final part of this week's Rugby League Back Chat. Martin, I'm going to come to you first, because one story in League Express was about the fact that we could be having compulsory reserve grade next year for Category 1 clubs with Category 1 academies. Gary, I'm sure you've got plenty to say on this, but Matt, I'm going to come to you first. What's your take on this development?
Well, actually, I'd have been interested to hear what Gary said first, really, because I know Gary's, very keen on the idea that the academy is the reserve grade. I've got to say, though, that I think, as I understand this proposal, and I'm not sure I understand it fully yet, but the clubs with Category 1 academies are going to be asked to have reserve grade teams. But as part of that development, the academy competition has been talked of as being reduced to under 18 from under 19, which I think that makes a fair degree of sense, because at the moment the academy, you go from scholarship, which is under 16, to academy, which is under 19. So you've actually got 3 age groups within the academy competition. And at that age, I think that's quite a tough one, because, to go from under 16 to be then playing against kids who are 19, bearing in mind how quickly, kids grow at that age, is quite a demanding thing. So I think being under 18 is more logical, so that the kids who are 19 can then play in this reserve grade competition if it comes about. But I'm sure that Gary will now tell us that that probably isn't going to happen, and he doesn't agree with it.
The floor is yours, Gary.
Yeah, well, we have a reserve grade, and that reserve grade team is our academy, and that's where we get our players for the first team. I think the Super League clubs have invested literally millions of pounds into the academy and scholarship system over the last decade, and the standards now are better than they've ever been. I think most teams are well coached, well run, well organised. The standard of academy rugby is very good. Where it's lacking is we're still not getting the most talented athletes coming into our sport, and so I think the academy is developing players. If you looked, our best under 18s beat the Australians in 2 Test matches last year. However, we've still got a bit of a problem in that most of the players are coming from a few clubs and not spread right across the league, but the system is producing Super League players. And of course, once a player comes into our system at scholarship, they're effectively with us for 5 years, from the age of 14, 15, and then right through to age 19, nearly 20 in the academy system. So plenty of time for us to develop players, hopefully for our Super League team, if not ours, then they populate the rest of the game. So I think the system we've got actually works pretty well. And I believe that the future investment is not necessarily earmarked for post-academy players. In other words, a reserve grade will be 20, 21, 22, 23-year-old players typically. I think the investment needs to be channelled into development, into increasing the talent pools, getting more people, youngsters in particular, playing the game. So that investment needs to go into 7, 8, 9, 10-year-olds, and then therefore widening the pool for those that's coming into the scholarship.
You obviously use dual registration as well. You've got that relationship with Featherstone. A lot of players have come out and said they'd rather be playing for their club rather than playing on dual reg. So surely a reserve grade in that regard would be better for what the players want, would it not?
Well, it's all about player development, and that's got to be the number one objective. And our belief is that for our young players that's emerging and becoming Super League players, for their personal development, if they're not playing in our first team, the next best place to play is the Championship, which is a pretty good competition in itself. So these players are playing in meaningful matches in front of crowds, in matches that mean something, rather than on a park pitch playing against other trialists and players of not the same abilities. So I believe that the dual reg actually is a perfect model for player development and the emergence of quality young players. And our game, if it's going to put more investment, which it would need to do, because if you introduce a new tier of the competition, which would be reserve grade, where are those players coming from, and how are they going to get paid? They're going to have to all be contracted. They're going to be competing. Super League clubs will be competing with Championship clubs. They're going to have proper medical provision and cover and everything that goes with it. So if you're going to do the job right, there is a huge investment required.
That's obviously correct, Gary. Has the work been done to actually cost it?
I don't believe it has. I don't believe it has. I think there's a lot of fanciful ideas been floated about. I
mean, it's easy to have an idea in principle, but you've got to be able to work it in practice.
And if we had a surplus of players, if our game was awash with players, like it is in Australia, then the 3-tier system actually is a model. But as I said, it's got to be affordable and there's got to be the talent pool, and neither of those are prevalent in our game.
Jodie, what's your take on it all?
It's tough because obviously coming through the women's system is completely different to the men's, but there are some things that, especially now with the growth of the Women's Super League, we've seen similarities. So there's a few clubs that are developing under 19s. I know Leeds have got one, Saints have now got one. And then the community clubs where they're actually getting game time and they're competing. Like you say, the championship, it's real games and you're competing for, to win the league and really important games where you're playing with people older and gaining that experience. And then there's a 19 structure where they're getting that top class support in the Saints environment, learning, the Saints way of playing through the Saints coaching, so that then when they adjust then into the team, that's maybe an easier transition. But it's a tough one because the amateur clubs are saying they should be here playing, and we have girls that do both, so they'll play 19s for 19s fixtures, and they play for an amateur side to get some game time throughout the season. So I think, similar to what Gary said, if the cost is there to do it right and the players are there, then great. But if it's not, I think the players playing in the championship, they're going to gain more experience and be able to win them big games. Like Brad Dwyer, he stepped up and he did it when it mattered. That's playing in big games that you learn to do that sort of thing.
Is there not an argument though, Martin, that by having dual reg and so Danny Richardson's playing for Lee at the minute, he was in the dream team last year, Super League dream team, are you not tarnishing the integrity of the championship when players like that are turning up? I think Matty Smith turned up for one fixture for Sheffield last year as an example. Is there not the fear that you're diminishing the championship a little bit? Well,
I don't like dual registration for that reason. I'm a great believer in clubs having integrity and so on. And when Danny Richardson turns out for Lee and not St Helens, I think that's a bit difficult to really take on board for a lot of people and a lot of fans.
If we're in the entertainment business, Barry, why would you not want to?
It's not just the entertainment business. It's not just the entertainment business. Being a rugby league fan or being a fan of a club is not quite the same thing as being, say a fan of a rock music band or something.
Does rugby league fans not want to watch better quality players?
Well, they want to watch their own play. They identify with the clubs. I mean, I got an interesting example of this recently because we actually put a shot of Featherstone on one of our front pages, and the players were actually Leeds players.
It was Ashton Golding.
This guy said on Twitter, he said, seeing that photograph, those are not Featherstone players. I'm not going to watch Featherstone again until, they are genuinely Featherstone players. And I mean, you might say, well, that's a bit quirky and a bit extreme, but a lot of fans are actually quite dedicated in that sense to their clubs and want their clubs to, have players who are, committed to their team more than to another team, because ultimately, at the end of the day, a dual registered player will be committed to his Super League team, obviously much more than his team. And I know some players who have, really had to go to Championship or League One clubs on dual registration, really under protest, to be honest. They don't want to be there, some of them, and they feel pretty angry about it and disillusioned. Whereas if they were playing for a club's reserve grade side, that'd be a lot easier.
Not our experience.
No, well, I'm not saying it's everybody's experience, but it is some people's.
And without playing devil's advocate, there are success stories of dual reg.
Oh yes,
there are players that have gone and played dual registration.
Yeah.
Matty Costello is one. He was a young Championship Player of the Year last year, and then he's played a couple of games for Saints already this year. He's still playing a little bit for Lee. But there are other examples. There are examples at Leeds as well. So do we need to try and find a balance, Gary, of keeping that integrity of the Championship, but providing
it's not an integrity issue. Players can go on loan anyway. We've always had a loan system, so players loans happen. Players come out of contract and go join other clubs. So I don't think it's an integrity issue at all. I think player development is an important one, I think I think
player development is vital, Gary.
Absolutely,
I couldn't agree more with you on that one. I mean, it's quite interesting, isn't it, to look at the England squads that were announced last week and look at where all those players come from. And, there are, certain clubs that have lots of players there. There are certain other clubs and certain towns and cities, actually, that are supposedly Rugby League heartland cities that have very few players there. I'm thinking of Hull in particular. Hull as a city should be producing far more players than it seems to be at the moment.
And in fact, didn't produce a single player for the England squad in the Test series against Australia. So that's a huge issue for the game.
It is.
It's a huge issue for the whole city and for the two professional clubs in Hull. And you've got to examine the reasons why that's happening.
They merged their academy, but it doesn't seem. I mean, I'm sure their academy is well organised, but for them to have just one academy between two major clubs, I think is still quite disappointing. No matter what people say.
So the problem is not there. What do they do with their 20-odd-year-old players? It's why aren't there more 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old players playing in that city?
Exactly, yes.
Well, I'd love to carry on this conversation, but we have got other things to discuss as well. We all want to talk about Ottawa and New York. That meeting, their presentations are coming up very shortly. Jodie, what's your take on potentially Ottawa and New York playing rugby league in the British structure next year?
I think it's exciting, but at the same time, I'm not a club owner and I'm not someone who has to think about the logistics of how that's going to work. And I know there's a lot of talk of them coming into League One, and I just don't, if you're going to do it, I just don't think that makes any sense. They've got to go into the Championship. They've got to be playing Toronto. The whole point of it is that these big games and you get in the interest of Canada and America, well, they're not going to be interested, with the greatest respect, if it's a game against, like Batley and that sort of thing. That's not going to bring in the real big interest of them countries.
That's a really good point. I think, talking about the academy, as the work being done, I'm not aware that a proper feasibility study has actually been done. So I think the three North American clubs could possibly offer huge potential for the sport. There might be a lot of downsides. I don't know. I don't think that I'm not aware that work has been done, and we need all the information to hand. But I think, on the face of it, there is a huge opportunity for the sport. Three North American teams, I agree with you, it needs to be in championship level. And I think it represents a huge opportunity for championship to really invigorate itself. There's already been significant development with Championship Rugby League, the standard of it. But I think for them to have three North American teams in that competition, potential revenue streams in the future, potential sponsorship, I think it just gives a new dynamic to the sport.
Sorry, just on that point as well, in terms of how America particularly are so good at marketing sports. What we always, everyone involved in rugby league knows it's a great sport. When you're involved, you don't need to convince anybody. It's convincing the non-rugby league people to get involved and watch it. And America do that so well. Most of their big sports, nobody else plays, but it doesn't matter because they market things so well. So if we can get big names, people with a lot of money involved who know how to take the game to the next level, we need to take advantage, but it's got to be feasible and it's got to be planned out right now. I think
the interesting thing on this, it is the Americans and the Canadians who are looking at bringing it to our sport. We don't, there's not a requirement for us to have to go to New York or Ottawa or even Toronto to actually promote the sport for them. That's the interesting concept to this time.
The other thing, Gary, though, to think about as well, it's got long-term ramifications because, coming back to Super League now, the current TV deal runs to the end of 2021, as I understand it. So from 2022, you're going to have a new TV deal, hopefully. We're not sure how it's going to work, who it's going to be with, whether it's still Sky or, multifaceted deal. But we need to be planning for that.
Course,
and, we need to know... how many teams are going to be in Super League from 2022? Is it going to be still 12? Is it going to be 14? Is it going to be 16? If it were going to be 16, how would we select them?
In that regard, when New York and Ottawa present to you later this month, what are you wanting to see?
I'm not so sure that they will. The process has been managed by the RFL.
I think it's Championship and League One clubs.
So I'm not so sure whether Super League will be involved. So they should be, because presumably these clubs are looking to aspire to come into the Super League. So the Super League needs to have a view on all this, and so it is the process is for the game, the RFL to manage, but also the Super League clubs to have an involvement, as indeed all the Championship clubs to have an involvement as well.
Is the speculation true that the Super League clubs are wary of having too many North American clubs long term in the competition?
That will be a view by some. That will be a view, but I think the problem is we don't really know. We don't have any real information to hand. We've not had presentations. We don't know the facts, and we don't know the potential. We need a proper feasibility study, and we've got to look at all aspects of it. And I'm not aware that work has been done.
Martin, yes or no? New York and Ottawa?
Well, it's got to be yes, provisionally to both of them, hasn't it? You know, because obviously anybody can see the advantage to having a New York team, you know, playing professional. If you can't see that advantage, you're blind. And Ottawa, I think Eric Perez made the point in our newspaper last week that, you know, he's got this link now with this organisation that already owns 3 professional sports clubs in Ottawa. And, you know, they play at one of the stadiums there that makes Lamport Stadium look pretty basic, really, to be honest, which, of course, it is. So, I mean, it would be absolutely foolish. Ottawa's the capital of Canada. So to have rugby league being played by a professional team in the capital city of Canada, you'd be nuts to sort of just turn that down without analysing it properly, wouldn't you?
Well, we need to wrap up there, unfortunately. That is pretty much all we've got time for this week. Don't forget that you can keep up to date with everything on this channel at www.freesports.tv. A big thanks to our guests this week. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time for another edition of Rugby League Back Chat. Bye-bye for now.